This week we'll look at the social cognitive factors on learning and motivation. This lecture is going to be broken into two parts. This is the first part of two. When looking at the social cognitive factors of motivation, we're really looking at motivation from an internal perspective. So what are the key factors that influence motivation from an internal perspective? We can look at this equation to help us understand. It says motivation equals values and goals multiplied by self-efficacy multiplied by emotions and attributions. We will be addressing each of these factors in this lecture, but let's take a look at this equation for a second. Why do you suppose the multiplicative and not additive sign or any other sign is used? If we were to remove these factors and assign each component a number, we would come up with a product. The danger is coming up with a zero for any one of these factors because, as we learned in elementary school, any number times zero is zero. Thus, if any of these factors is zero, whether it's a lack of goals or no self-efficacy for a task, it would result in a lack of motivation. As we learned in the lecture on metacognition and self-regulation, there is no motivation or there's pseudo-motivation without goals. What we'll look at this week is the close tie between our values and goals, and how we run into trouble when our goals are based on something other than our values, or our values are not the foundation of our goals. So if we look at productivity, meaning our ability to accomplish the goals that we've set out, we can kind of look at it in terms of this pyramid. At the base of what we're doing each day should really be our values. These values should really feed into our aspirations, which then become our long-range goals. While aspirations can be very far into the future, long-range goals themselves, which are much more specific and timely, are really from 1 to 5 years. So think about the goals you have for what you want to do after you graduate, whether it's going to graduate school, performing on stage, being a professional athlete, or starting your own business. These are the goals that you have that would be long range. These are goals and not aspirations if they are tied to intermediate goals. These goals are not in the immediate future, but they are much closer than long range. These could be semesterly goals. For example, do you have a goal for a GPA this semester? Or a goal to attain an internship or a new job by Christmas time? What drives these intermediate goals then becomes our daily tasks or our performance goals. These are the things that we set out for ourselves to do on an hourly, daily, or weekly basis. These tasks do not extend far beyond 5 to about 7 days. When we look at the relationship between these four sections, we can see that what really drives our goals, from the long range to the intermediate to the daily goals that we have, is really our values. So while our values are the foundation of the different types of goals that we have for ourselves, it's really our daily tasks that change long-range goals from aspirations into goals. If we look at this from another perspective, our values are really why we're doing the things that we do. The intermediate and the long-range goals are what we're trying to accomplish, and our daily tasks are the how. How are we going to get there? And it is these daily tasks that are aligned with our intermediate and long-range goals that change a long-range goal from an aspiration into a goal. Without a plan of how to get there from a daily to a weekly to a monthly to a semesterly basis, we really don't have goals at all. Our long-range goals would only remain aspirations or dreams. The key to having long-range goals that you're able to accomplish is having these intermediate and specific daily tasks. This is how you will arrive at your long-range goals that should be based in your values. So why is attending USC valuable to you? What is the value that you derive from being a student here? 1, 2, or 3 of the following 3 answers may be a reason why. You may have a personal interest in learning and earning a college degree. Maybe you're studying psychology or chemistry, and you've always had a passion or an interest in this subject. Or maybe it is important for you as a daughter or a son to get an education because this is one of your family values and one of the things that was instilled in you as you were raised. Or maybe it is useful for your future to earn a degree. You may be interested in a career such as being an entrepreneur where you don't necessarily need a college degree, but you know you will learn skills here and make connections at USC that will be useful in your future. When we take a closer look at these three examples, you see that they're similar in the way that they all speak to your value for being at USC, but they're different in the reasoning that being a student here is valuable. The first speaks to personal interest, the second to importance, and the third to the usefulness of being a student. These three different values are not all created equally, but all are important and speak to the value you should have that is tied to your goals. The strongest of these three values is personal interest, which is tied to our intrinsic motivation. Anything that you have a personal passion for, that you love to do, that no one has to pay you to do, that no coach or teacher or adult has to talk you into doing, that you'll do in your free time. This is something that you have a personal interest for. For example, you may have a personal interest in psychology, and so while you have written or reading assignments for your classes, you may end up reading other articles that weren't assigned or having conversations about the content that you read because of your personal interest. Basically, our personal interests drive us to go beyond what the assignment is. Another example would be maybe as an athlete, you have a lot of practice and time that you have to spend with your team or your coaches. If you have a true passion and personal interest in the sport, you'll take that beyond what is mandated. You'll have time on your own where you're either strategizing how you're going to improve your skills, or you may be on the field or the court working on your skills. In the second bullet, it notes that being a student may be important for you, and this really speaks to your self-concept, how you feel about yourself in whichever role you're thinking about, as a daughter, as a son, as a student. Maybe it's important for you to give your best in a class because you see yourself as a good student, and good students give their best. So when things are important to us, they also drive our motivation. The last bullet speaks to usefulness, and while this is a value that is tied to our goals, this is the weakest of the three. Something that is useful for us may end up costing too much in time or other resources, and we may end up giving up the goal if it is not important to us in some way or if we don't have a vested interest in it. So think about this. Why are you here at USC? Do you have a personal interest? Is it important to you as a person, as a daughter, as a son, as a student, as a member of society? How is it going to be useful for your future? These values are what drive your motivation. If you find that your value is very heavily in the last one, in the usefulness, it will behoove you to look for an importance for who you are as a person in any one of your roles, and to seek out a personal interest that ties you to being a student at USC. These will in turn increase your motivation and drive you to complete your long-range goals. When looking at our values and goals, we also need to consider our goal orientation. These are not the goals that we set themselves or our strategies for setting them, but this is also what drives our goals. Are we focused on mastery, or do we have a mastery goal orientation? Or are we focused on performance, or having a performance goal orientation? When considering our goal orientation, one of the key factors that distinguishes between these two orientations is how we define success and failure. For someone that has a mastery goal orientation, they're focused on the learning itself, on the mastery of whatever skill or knowledge they're trying to attain. Someone with a mastery goal orientation knows that they're being successful if they have continued improvement, and the end goal is always the mastery of the learning. For someone with a performance goal orientation, they define whether or not they're successful or a failure by comparing themselves to others. So if they perform and their performance improves, but they don't do as well as others in their peer group, they will see themselves as failures. If we take these two orientations and we look at them in a similar situation, you can think of a student who studied for a test and scored a 95%. Someone who is mastery goal oriented would look at whether or not their performance has improved over time or whether or not they've attained the skills and learning that they set out to do. Someone with a performance goal orientation would look to see what others in the class scored on the test. This would help them to define whether or not they were successful. So for the student who scored a 95%, even if their previous score in the class was a 90, they would see themselves as a failure if people around them scored a 96, a 97, or a 98. On the other hand, if their score had dropped from a previous performance, but everyone else in the class had a score of 89, 90, or 91, they would see their performance as a success. Oftentimes, someone who has a performance goal orientation doesn't know how to define whether or not they've succeeded or failed until they can compare their score or their performance to another student's. Now, this isn't to say that we always have a mastery or a performance goal orientation. We have different goal orientations for different classes, for different tasks, for different areas of our lives. And these two orientations overlap. But when a student is more performance goal oriented than mastery goal oriented, they can run into problems. When does performance goal orientation work? It works really well when things are going great, when you're doing better than others, when you see yourself as a success. You get assured of your ability. The focus for performance goal orientation is on ability, while mastery goal orientation is on effort. However, when someone with the majority of performance goal orientation encounters failure, this is where the feeling of an inferior ability is directly pointed out. Students with a performance orientation usually hold that mistakes or errors are a sign of low ability and failure, while students with a mastery orientation hold that errors are just a part of the process and use them as learning goals. If you endorse only performance goals or are very heavily handed in performance goals, mistakes and low grades are likely to affect you in a negative way and create a lot of anxiety. Another way to look at motivation is in terms of whether or not we are approaching success or avoiding failure. Think about a goal you may have in mind. Are you keeping your eyes on the prize? Are you looking into the future? Are you looking at the tasks that you need to accomplish in order to approach your goal? Or are you more focused on failure? Are you focused on not becoming a failure, on avoiding the failure? That is to say, are you focused on being successful, being a successful student, being a successful performer or athlete, as opposed to being anxious about or focusing on what would happen if you weren't a successful student, if you failed out of school, if you bombed on the stage, or failed on the court? Covington and Roberts said that students can have a high or low motive to approach success and a high or low motive to avoid failure. We'll take a look at these four now. If a student has a very low approach to success and a very low avoidance of failure, these students tend to be failure acceptors. They're not really concerned about being successful, and they're also not too concerned about being seen as a failure. They're not too concerned about accomplishing their goals, and they're not too concerned or worried about what happens if they don't accomplish their goals. And so they tend to be accepting of whatever failure or lack of accomplishments come their way. Again, you see here that the operative word is motive, and on both of these, the motive is very low, which results in a low motivation. If we look at the other hand, at the other extreme, and we have a student who is very high in their motive to approach success, so they're very focused on their goal in mind. They have their long-range goals, they have their intermediate goals, and their daily tasks, and they're very much focused on accomplishing these. But at the same time, there is a very high need to avoid failure. This produces a lot of anxiety, and this tends to result in students who are overstrivers. The student who may start their paper as soon as it's assigned, but continue to work on it until the last minute before they turn it in. The student who will read and study the chapter all weekend and never taking a break for themselves. This can often cause burnout in students. If we next look at a student who has a low motivation to approach success and a high motivation to avoid failure, these are failure avoiders. This is a student who will not face challenges, who will not push through obstacles, who just wants to do enough to get by. They're okay with not reaching the highest of goals as long as they're not seen as being a complete failure. Opposite of that is a student who has a high approach for success and a low motive to avoid failure. While you would think that being low in a motivation would actually lower motivation in general, this actually reduces anxiety. And so the student is not only able to focus on their goals, but is also able to avoid the anxiety that a lot of times paralyzes students when it comes to giving their best. This also helps the student balance their life with not only education, but also their social life or extracurricular activities, and ultimately helps them avoid burnout. So where do you think performance and goal orientation lie? Performance orientation is more heavily at the bottom because performance orientation produces anxiety, and a motivation to avoid failure is also very high in anxiety. These students are very highly focused on not being failures, and this results in anxiety and an inability to completely focus on their goals. Mastery orientation, you may have guessed, is in the top right corner, where students have a very low anxiety level, a very low need to avoid failure, but a very high need to approach success. You'll notice that the failure acceptors are not labeled as mastery or performance oriented, and this again is because their motivation to both approach success and avoid failure is very low, and so their motivation as a result is extremely low. Next, we're going to take a close look at self-efficacy. Take a second to read the quote below. You can see that what we're about to discuss is how our beliefs affect our motivation and our ability to be successful. So what is self-efficacy? Go ahead and read these 4 definitions and choose the definition that's correct. If you chose the second definition, then you chose correctly. Let's eliminate these other 3 and decide why they are not the definitions for self-efficacy. Let's look at the first 2 at the bottom. Self-efficacy is not predicted by our self-esteem or self-worth. Self-esteem and self-worth are much more general and are more feelings than beliefs. The first 2 are correct because it says that self-efficacy is a belief, but the first answer is not correct because it says that it's a belief about our overall ability. Self-efficacy is much more task-specific. The 2 key factors that you need to remember when thinking of self-efficacy is that number 1, it is a belief. It is not a feeling. It is not emotional. It's our cognitive belief about our ability. The second thing is that it's task-specific. It's a very specific belief about how well we can accomplish a certain task. So while in general you may have high self-efficacy for writing tasks, you may have higher self-efficacy for research papers than for creative writing papers. This, however, can change from task to task. So throughout your college career, you may have enjoyed writing research papers and had a high confidence level for them, but you may have encountered a class, a content area, or a specific assignment that kind of shook this belief or this confidence in your ability to write research papers. Maybe the level was kicked up a notch, the professor's expectations of your writing was increased, and this shook your belief or your confidence a bit. Hopefully you mastered that writing task, which would inevitably result in a self-efficacy boost. So what is the difference between self-efficacy and self-esteem, or self-efficacy and self-worth? We said that self-efficacy is a belief, where self-worth or self-esteem are more feelings, and they're much broader than self-efficacy. Where self-efficacy is task-specific, self-esteem and self-worth are our general feelings about ourselves. They're kind of the gestalt of all of the different feelings we have about the roles that we have in our lives or about our ability to accomplish our goals. So when you think about self-esteem or self-worth, it's kind of the overall evaluation of how we feel about ourselves, where self-efficacy is more task-specific and is a belief in our ability to accomplish a specific task. So you can see our self-efficacy changes more frequently or is more variable than our overall self-esteem or self-worth. So why is it important for us to have high self-efficacy? Research has shown us that students with high self-efficacy will choose more challenging goals. People don't tend to seek things out that they don't believe they're going to be successful at. And so the level of your goal is determined by your level of self-efficacy about that particular task. Research also tells us that students with high self-efficacy not only choose more difficult tasks, but they expend greater effort, they persist longer, they use more complex learning strategies, and they experience less fear or anxiety, meaning that their motivation to avoid failure is much lower, while their belief and confidence in themselves lends to a much higher approach for success. This means that students with high self-efficacy tend to be those students in the top right corner, the success-oriented students on our 4-quadrant matrix. This also results in people with higher self-efficacy about a task spending less time worrying about it and more time solving the problem in creative ways. So what if a student doesn't have high self-efficacy for a task? How would they increase it? There are 4 sources of self-efficacy. The first being mastery experiences. This is an experience that you've had with previous successes or failures. It's a mastery experience if you've been successful. The next source of self-efficacy are vicarious experiences. A lot of times we don't need to actually experience the learning or the success ourselves. We can actually get a boost of self-efficacy from a relatable peer, someone who we can relate to and who we see as someone who is similar to ourselves. If we see that person or we observe that person being successful, it actually results in our own self-efficacy increasing. On the other hand, if we see someone that we relate to, someone who is similar to ourselves, be unsuccessful at a task, this will decrease our self-efficacy. The third source of self-efficacy is social persuasion, or the good old-fashioned pep talk. Social persuasion can also be dichotomous. They can be split up into what I call cheers and jeers. The cheers are the pep talk. The coach, the friend, the parent, the trusted other has such a belief in you that you actually start to adopt that belief and will give you the confidence boost that you need to partake in the task. On the other hand, this can also work in the opposite way. If you encounter someone who doesn't believe in you and gives you self-doubt, this can lower your self-efficacy. And unfortunately, it's much easier to lower self-efficacy through social persuasion than it is to increase it. This is why it's always important to surround yourself with people who support your goals, who support your values, and who encourage you to be successful. The last source of self-efficacy is your physiological or emotional state. This is how you're actually feeling. For example, if you're waiting in class to give your presentation and you notice that you start to tremble, your hands start to sweat, your breathing becomes more rapid and your heart rate increases, this physiological state can start to lower your self-efficacy or make you feel less confidence than you may have previously felt. When this type of situation arises, whether it's anxiety before taking a test or before giving a presentation or before going on stage, etc., it's important to recognize that our fight or flight response has probably been triggered, and we really need to calm ourselves down. We can do this by reassuring ourselves in our own mind that everything is okay, that you are well prepared, that you know your speech, or you know the information because you've used multiple strategies. You can also accomplish this through physiological measures such as deep breathing or meditation, which is shown to lower anxiety and increase mindfulness. You can also avoid this type of anxiety by psyching yourself up prior to whatever performance or task you're going to partake in. A lot of times athletes are very good at this, where they have a routine that they execute prior to their performance that gets them in the zone, that gets them mentally prepared for accomplishing their task. So with regard to self-efficacy, it's important to ask yourself, what tasks do you have either high or low self-efficacy for? How can you increase your self-efficacy, which in turn will increase your motivation? Do you need to practice or have other mastery experiences? Another way would be to seek out a person who is similar to you, who's relatable to you, who has accomplished something that you have set as a goal. Ask them how they struggled through it. Ask them what their experience was. And if they give you their story, a lot of times you'll find they didn't just get it the first time around, that they had strategies and they had to overcome obstacles, and their story will in turn give you a self-efficacy boost. You also need to be sure to surround yourself with people who are cheering you on, as opposed to tearing you down. Remember, the messages that we receive about ourselves from other people will also affect our self-efficacy, ultimately affecting our motivation to succeed. And lastly, be proactive, psych yourself up, especially when you know that this task coming up may cause a bit of anxiety. Figure out what routines are effective for you in getting yourself mentally prepared to take on tasks that are more challenging.